present. And then we can have discussion after each talk and maybe some more discussion at the end. Sean would like to be the first. Whenever you are ready, Sean, you can begin.
All right, so my timer. All right, so as you guys can see, my first year project's based on rollover. But a lot of you might be asking what rollover load is because I've never talked to you about it before, and you don't have any experience with the field. So before we dive into everything, I'll give you a brief working definition of what that is. So rollover load, briefly defined, is an individual's perception of the mismatch between their time and ability and the task that they are given, such as doing something at work. So next you might be asking, okay, we now know what role overload is, but why does it matter? And that's going to be the first thing we're going to be looking at today is the outcomes and importance of role overload. After that, we'll be diving into the definitional issues that are occurring in the literature and our proposed definitions that we hope to we're constructing a new scale on to help solve some of these definitional issues. And we'll also be looking at the methodological issues that current scales have and how we hope to improve our scale through psychometrical validation. And then we'll be looking specifically at my project. So the first thing we're looking at is the outcomes of role overload. And we see there's a lot of outcomes for role overload. I just chose some of them, and I believe these are some of the more important ones. And we see there's outcomes for an organization and individual. And both of these outcomes are very negative to what role overload is, and they're very strong correlations as well. So for example, we have intent to turn over being correlated with role overload at 0.3. And considering how many aspects of life go into an employee's intent to turn over, that is a large correlation. Additionally, on the individual levels, we also see these negative outcomes as well. For example, we have a correlation of 0.6 with work interfering with family and 0.56 of a correlation with emotional exhaustion that is correlated with Maslow's burnout imaging. Whoever that is, can you mute their mic or something? Because it's really loud. Thank you. So where was I? Yes, so we see there's a lot of negative outcomes for role overload, and they're very strong. But you might be asking, okay, well, this is a very negative outcome, but is it actually an issue in the workforce? Is it prevalent? And yes, it very much is prevalent. And the most recent study I could find that looked at a nationwide survey of role overload was in 2001, and specifically this was for Canada. But they found that 59% of the workforce reported role overload then. And compared to the previous study they did in 1991, this was an 11-point increase over that decade. And we have reason to believe, based on what they described as the reasons for this increase, that it's even increasing further today. The main reason they talked about it increasing for individuals is one, downsizing, and two, technology blurring the lines between what work and home life is. And I'm pretty sure everyone in the pandemic currently has some aspect of their home and work life being blurred tremendously, and it kind of increases their accessibility and the amount they might perceive they have to do. So it increases the prevalence of role overload. The good news is that role overload is actionable by organizations and employees. So for example, organizations can address the conditions that cause role overload, such as staffing, complexity, lack of training. But the issue with that is we don't have clear conceptual definitions of role overload, and we don't have good measures of role overload. And those measures of role overload aren't diagnostic. So we're trying to solve an issue that we can't clearly define and we can't clearly measure. So it's not working out too well. So to figure out why that issue is occurring, we're going to look at where role overload kind of originated from. So it originated in 1964 with the role stressor literature by Kahn et al. There are three main role stressors in this literature: role conflict, which you see on here as a definition and an example item below it, and role ambiguity, which you see on the screen and the definition below it, and role overload. However, that's currently. Initially, role overload was conceptualized as a subdimension of role conflict. However, researchers in the 70s and beyond suggested that role overload was in fact its own dimension and construct, and has been substantiated by numerous researchers after that. So that brings us to what role overload, what is back then, really. Role overload back then was defined as a type of role stressor that's specifically related to the total time and energy needed to fulfill role demands. So this is different than a lot of other of the role aspects, but it can be confused with a lot of them. So, for example, a person may experience conflicting demands of multiple roles. This would be role conflict. But unless time pressure, in this case, is an issue, he or she will not necessarily encounter role overload. In addition, we can distinguish role overload specifically from other types of time-based conflict, which occur because of simultaneously occurring demands from two or more roles. And another issue that has come out because of this initial conceptualization of role overload is that role conflict and role overload tend to be used interchangeably in the literature, when in fact they are distinct concepts. And I see that till today is that role overload is misconceptualized and interchanged with this role conflict or workload. And I've seen this in meta-analysis even where they confound the two and put them together and think they're the same concept when they're distinctly not. So this brings us more to some of the issues with the conceptualization. So a lot of these issues stem from wide variations in the definitions of our key constructs of what role overload is. In addition, the literature doesn't tend to consider role overload over different types of role overload, and it doesn't consider role overload across roles. So specifically, the main aspects of a life are pretty much work and family. A lot of psychology is only really looked at work role overload and doesn't as much consider family role overload, whereas a lot of sociology has looked at family role overload and doesn't look at the work role overload. So we don't have these two sides of role overload connecting, and it's very important that we look at a person's entire life when we're seeing if they're experiencing role overload. And this is because overload within any singular role is not a necessary precondition for overload in the total role set. So meaning if we say, for example, we are not overloaded in work, then we're not overloaded in our family lives. But together we do feel overloaded because we are just basically at the cusp of each. With our current measures, we wouldn't ever pick that up. We wouldn't know about it. We would just think, okay, this person's fine. They aren't overloaded at work. And that's a huge issue. We're trying to predict we're trying to predict something we have no clue of how to predict because we don't have the whole picture. So in essence, the main issues that we have with the conceptualization is the views of role overload have not changed substantially over time. So this is a good thing in the fact that role overload has been considered its own construct, but it's also bad because we aren't considering role overload across total role sets, and we aren't considering multiple types of role overload. In addition, this term role overload has been wrongly interchangeably used with role strain, role stress, time-based strain, role conflict, and a quantitative workload. These are all distinct separate concepts, but they are continuously confused and confounded with each other in the literature. So that brings us to our proposed definitions and how we hope to kind of nail down this concept and increase the diagnostic ability of a measure so we can actually figure out what we're measuring and how we can actionalize it. So our first measure is that we believe we need to look at total role overload. So we need to look at an individual's life and look at all of their lives. So we define total role overload as it is an individual's perception that the collective demands of his/her multiple roles exceed available time, energy, and ability, making the individual unable to adequately fulfill the requirements of his/her various roles to the satisfaction of self or others. We believe this is the overarching definition for our scale, and there are roughly 7 dimensions we have in them, and we will discuss what these are right now. So the first dimensions, these will make up 6 of our dimensions, and I'll talk about how they make up 6 after I define them, is that we have quantitative role overload. So quantitative role overload is really what you would think of as I have too much work to do, and I don't have enough time to do it in. So it's the perceived conflict between the demand of the job as an organizational citizen and the time availability for meeting the job demand. Whereas qualitative role overload is considered as the perceived mismatch between the demand of the job and the individual's abilities, necessary skills, knowledge, and aptitude to do the job. So they aren't well prepared, the job's too difficult for them, etc. And the reason why I say there are 6 here is because we are crossing these work role overload dimensions with the taxonomy of data, people, and things to help create a more diagnostic ability for our scale. So we'll have, for example, quantitative data role overload dimension, quantitative people roll over the dimension. So they're interacting with people too much, for example. And that's why we say there is 6. And then the final dimension we have is family rollover. We believe we have to contextualize work. We can't just say, look at work in its own vacuum. Family life plays a dramatic role in a lot of decisions people make and impacts work just as much as work impacts work. So we define family rollover pretty much exactly how they're defined in the sociology literature, because they have looked at rollover a lot and we haven't really in psychology. So it is the perceived conflict between demands of family roles, be that a parent, spouse, caregiver, or friend, and the time availability for meeting the family role demands. And we adapted items from Cook and Russo's 1984 scale to kind of better mirror our work rollover items. But they are in essence the same. We just changed some of the wording to better mirror items. So for example, one of these items is, I never seem to have enough time to get all my family work done. So now that we have more of a kind of clearer definitional basis of what rollover is, we're going to examine some of the current issues with the measures of rollover in the literature is. So we're going to be looking at qualitative first, and then we'll be looking at quantitative. So the issue with qualitative is there's just not much research looking into the measures for qualitative rollover load. The scales that do look at it are extremely ad hoc one-item measures or extremely vague. So these ad hoc items are just not validated at all. We have an example down here is, I like and enjoy my life. This conceivably could measure qualitative rollover, but unless you're showing me that it actually does, this doesn't have any face validity that I could just say, yes, this is a qualitative rollover item that I would believe that is. And that's what we find a lot in the qualitative literature. And it's probably one of the main reasons it just hasn't been researched much, just because there's no scales that have been validated or looked at to research this phenomenon. Next one we're going to be looking at is the quantitative measures. So this one has slightly the opposite issue, is there's no widely accepted measure of rollover load. There's over 20, closer to 30 different measures found in the literature, and numerous measures of these are ad hoc measures, which are unvalidated. And a lot of these measures have been shown to be misconceptualized and unreliable by later researchers. So we'll be showing this by looking at the most widely used measure. So this is from Riley et al.'s 1982 study of convenience consumption in stay-at-home wives. It was a 13-item scale. And first note of the note is that studies that incorporate this scale consistently reach contradictory conclusions. So because of that, some people decided to actually investigate this scale. And this scale was found to have 3 measures that were unsatisfactory at an alpha level, all item discrimination metrics. And in addition, of the 10 remaining items, only 6 of those items loaded onto the same factor. And the scale theoretically should only have 1 factor. So only 6 of these items are actually performing as they should when it was a 13-item scale. This was demonstrating the need for psychometric validation for scales in this field, and how no scales currently are really psychometrically validated. So that brings us to our project and how we kind of hope to address this issue. So our first study is we're doing item piloting and a factor analysis of that. So in our first study, we started out with 96 items we previously created, and we took this down to 22 based on a lot of metrics and similarity indices that we looked at. And these alphas now we found of these remaining subdimensions were at 0.95 or higher. And when we had that, we did factor analysis where we imposed the confirmatory factor analysis of what we perceived the theoretical construct was based on what we designed the dimensions to be. And we found adequate fit, and the factors loaded very cleanly and at a high level. The second study we did was substantive validity. So we were looking to establish some content validity of the study. And how we did that was we also looked at the old studies. We specifically looked at Theogram's improved version of the Riley scale we just talked about. And we also looked at Bear et al.'s version of the scale. And that's the second most used rollover scale. And we found that we significantly improved upon the content validity. We had effect sizes of up to 2 for our improvement on the substantive validity. Next, we hope to look at the construct validity of our scale by constructing a nomenological network. We've already constructed our kind of nomenological network where we believe, based on prior literature and everything, that we believe our scale should line up with this and all these other constructs. And we hope to validate that this winter, coming spring, on a sample we grab from Mentor. Then after my thesis defense, we hope to cross-validate these results on non-mechanical participants in order to publish this publish this study. And then finally, here is an example of one of our scales. So this specifically is the role overload data scale, and these are the items we have retained for it. So at the top, we ran by these instructions with other professors in the fields and experts, such as, for example, Paul Spector. We've ran by a lot of these by a lot of experts, and we've incorporated what they believe some changes should be. Those are, and we agree these are good instructions for what we are having down as our questions. And in our questions, we have both quantitative and qualitative. And the top part is our quantitative questions, as you can see references the amount of the thinking required by the individual. And at the bottom, we see the intensity, which is referencing the quantitative the qualitative aspect. And that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions about the items I have up or my study in general?
So you talked a lot about the different psychometric properties of the scales of measuring rule overload, but what would you consider to be an applicable use of rule overload specifically in the family area? So you can measure the overload for the family, but what can you do then, say in a practical setting?
For example, an organization could provide flex time for the individual. They could provide, might not be applicable now for working daycare services for the individual. Things along those lines, they can provide maybe counseling or something. If they have end of life, they're dealing with parents dying, they can understand a lot more about the individual. If they see this person's overloaded in the family aspect, let's delve more into that, ask them why. And that's the issue why they might be not performing as well at work. And we can understand that now. Better than, for example, they're saying they're overloaded. How are we going to deal with this? It just says they're overloaded at work. We have no context to kind of evaluate and deal with the situation.
All right, thank you.
Do we have other questions for Sean? If not, Vinci can get ready.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Do you all see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I guess I'll get started.
Go ahead.
Hi, so my name is Bincy Davis, and I'm a second-year student, and my research interest is leadership. My thesis is about leadership and secure base, and I spent most of my first-year experience conducting a lit review on this topic. So what got me here? It's my experience. Before joining our program, I worked in the industry for a few years, and my time in the industry has led me to believe that every employee should have a good boss. And the research question that brought me from the industry back to school is, what can we do to make leaders successful? So my plan for today's presentation is, first I'll talk about leadership, its definitions and theories. I'm going to talk about attachment theory and its key concept. I will also talk about how I'm integrating the two disparate concepts of leadership and attachment theory, and I will end with my research questions. So what is leadership? I'm sure we all have our own concept of leadership, and so do the researchers. There are as many definitions of leadership as there are leadership researchers. Fortunately, despite the differences, most researchers agree that leadership is a process whereby intentional influence is exerted by one person over other people to guide, structure, and facilitate activities and relationships in a group and in an organization. So it's a very intentional process that has two primary focus areas: tasks, activities, and relationships, people. Leadership helps people engage in various interpersonal relationships at work so that they can contribute to the overall organizational success. And leadership is a very well-researched topic, and we have many different theories of leadership. To give a brief summary, I have divided leadership into two primary categories: traditional and contemporary theories. Traditional theories focus primarily on the leader, their capabilities, and their situational context. So under traditional theories, we have trait theory, which stated that leaders possess innate attributes that make them different. In other words, leaders are born with it, for example, conscientiousness or agreeableness. Then we have behavioral theories. These theories stated that leader behaviors are learned. In other words, leaders are not born, but they are made, and so they can be trained. For example, a leader who practices accountability is most probably going to hold their team members accountable. And then we have contingency theories, which said that, well, leadership is not just about traits or behaviors, but it's the interaction of the leader's abilities with a given situation. So, for example, if the work environment is very stressful, a leader might be more supportive in style. In contrast to traditional theories, we have contemporary theories. They focus more on the relational aspect of leadership. And prominent among them is transformational leadership. Transformational leadership is defined as a leadership style that inspires people to achieve their overall goals. It encourages people to become the best self of themselves. Then we have the leader-member exchange theory. This focuses on the dyadic relationship between the leader and the follower. So if a leader believes in autonomy, the leader is going to make sure that their team members also enjoy autonomy. And then we have authentic style of leadership. This is a style of leadership where leaders are genuine and transparent in their interactions. They lead by example and encourage open communication. Now, these are just a few of the many leadership theories we have. The relational aspect emphasized in contemporary theories is no surprise because of the many ways researchers have defined leadership. They have also defined leadership as an interpersonal relational process. One of the most important work relationships that we all know employees have is the one they have with their boss. It's a two-way process, a relationship between those who desire to lead and those who choose to follow. And both these individuals are united by their common purpose of achieving organizational goals. And this relationship is the one that I'm primarily interested in. So how is attachment theory relevant? Research has found that a leader-follower relationship is analogous to parent-child relationship. A role includes guiding, directing, taking charge, and taking care of others. Like a parent, a leader needs to guide and support other individuals who often have less authority and power. So parental responsibility, as we all know, is primarily about instilling skills in children and assuring them of support when it's needed. And I think this imagery is absolutely apt for leaders as well, as they help employees perform the tasks that help them to learn and grow. Now, this is not to say that there are no differences between a leader-follower and a parent-child relationship. There sure are differences. Parent-child relationship is most often a familial relationship, and it usually lasts an individual, that is the parent's entire lifetime. Rarely do these two hold true for a leader-follower relationship. Unless it's a family business, followers don't have a familial tie with their leader, and the relationship is usually temporary. So when the job ends, usually you don't continue the relationship with your leader unless you truly want it to be a mentoring relationship. So what is attachment theory? John Bowlby formulated attachment theory, and the theory states that individuals possess an innate need to seek safety and comfort when faced with a presumed threat, and that individuals develop different strategies to make this possible based on their early life experiences. Bowlby conceptualized attachment theory to understand infants' intense distress when they get separated from their parents. He proposed that infants displayed a range of attachment behaviors like crying, clinging, or smiling, all of which are part of an infant's natural instincts to seek contact with their primary caregiver. And these attachment behaviors and subsequent experiences, they all have lifelong relational implications. And the key concepts of attachment theory are the attachment behavioral system, secure base, working models, and attachment styles. In the interest of time, I will focus on the concept of secure base, which is central to my research. So what is secure base? Mary Ainsworth coined the term secure base. Secure base is a perception of associating someone with safety and growth. which promotes exploration and risk-taking, basically enabling learning and growth. So what does it mean? When we come to associate someone consistently as our safety net, that is when we perceive that someone as our secure base. And this someone can be anyone, as in our significant other, a friend, a boss, a sibling, anyone from whom we consistently experience safety and encouragement. Now, secure base is not something one can offer. So, for example, let's say your boss cannot walk up to you and say, hey, I'm your secure base. So now you can feel safe and supported and encouraged. You have to be able to experience safety and support from your boss consistently for you to be able to perceive them as your secure base. But your boss can help build this perception for you by engaging in certain behaviors. And this brings me to my next slide, which is what behaviors are we talking about? So Mary Ainsworth and her colleagues worked with mothers for about a year and identified 4 maternal behaviors that enabled mothers to become secure base for their infants. And these behaviors are, the first one is sensitivity, which is attention to the infant's need. So is the infant hungry? Does the infant need a diaper change? The second is cooperation, which is helping as needed. So for example, if the infant is trying to turn over or walk and is not able to, does the mother lend a helping hand? Third is availability, which is being available physically and emotionally. So a physical availability example would be when the child is crying, does the mother come and carry the child? And emotional availability is, does the mother soothe the crying infant? Does the mother smile at the baby? And the last behavior identified is acceptance, which is unconditional love and support, reaffirming to the infant that no matter what, the mother is always going to be there for the baby and love the baby. So how am I integrating these two seemingly unrelated domains? In other words, why do we care about any of this? So research has found that in organizations, leaders fulfill certain aspects of the role of authoritative and primary caregivers. And they do this by supporting and regulating the distress experienced by employees that stems from everyday work life. And as leaders continue to consistently support and encourage their followers, employees perceive their leaders as secure bases, which is great because research has also found that when followers perceive their leader as a secure base, this perception was positively related to proactive work behavior, positive affectivity, and professional efficacy, and negatively related to negative affectivity, cynicism, emotional exhaustion, all expressions of job burnout. So if we know all of this, that leadership is important and attachment theory provides a unique perspective to explore the relational aspects of leadership, and that when leaders are perceived as secure bases, there are positive outcomes. So then why not just get leaders to do whatever it is that they need to do so that they can be perceived as secure bases by their employees? And that is where things get tricky. In addition to Ainsworth's work, so far I found only 3 studies that have attempted to explore behaviors that one could engage in so that the other could perceive them as a secure base. The first was a 2002 study. The study was conducted by researchers with 157 engaged couples, where they videotaped the couple's approach of working through a topic of disagreement. The next is a 2005 study that was done with foster children. It was a longitudinal study done in 2 phases. The phase 1 was when the children were placed with the foster parents. And then a few years later, they went back to study how well the foster children was integrated into the family of the foster parents. And the third study that I found was conducted in 2010. This is an unpublished dissertation where the study was conducted with members of a leadership training program. And these members were leaders in their respective organizations. They were doing well, so they were in the leadership training program. A couple of limitations with these studies is that obviously study 1 and 2 has not been, the results have not been translated into an organizational context. The study 3, I think, is a missed opportunity. So the researcher Coombe, he did a qualitative study and he identified 8 leader behaviors that would help employee perceive them as a secure base, following which he did an exploratory factor analysis and identified 5 underlying factors. And then he used the theoretical framework of attachment theory and got rid of 2 factors and stuck with 3 of the factors, which he then proposed for his research and moved on. But I think in this case, the lack of theoretical support should not have been used as the basis for determining factors, because attachment theory was formulated with infants and not adults. In fact, if there is a limitation to Mary Ainsworth's work, is that though she understood that organization of attachment behavior is open to experiences throughout one's lifetime, her analysis did not carry her insights into adulthood. I think it is very possible that the behaviors a parent engaged in that enable them to become a secure base may not be identical or even enough for an adult to experience a secure base, and that too in a work environment. What researchers have done is they have extended the tenets of attachment theory to adult relationships, but the original theory was meant for understanding infant development. So to sum up, limited research and the so-called limitations brings me to my 2 research questions. My first research question is, which leader behaviors will enable employees to perceive their leader as a secure base? So can a leader engage in the same parental behaviors and become a secure base? Was Coombe, the researcher of the unpublished dissertation, correct in discarding the 2 factors? I don't know. Hopefully my question will find answers to those. And my second research question is, can I model a relationship between leader behaviors, secure base, and employee outcomes? So to provide a little bit of clarity, this is the base model. This is what Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth were working and talking about. Behaviors, perception of secure base, and you have certain outcomes. But when I translate it to our work world, we have a not so simple model. And these are just variables that either I'm interested in or I have picked up based on the lit review that I've done. I'm sure there are a lot more variables that I'm not accounting for here. So for my thesis, the dotted relationships are not something that I'm going to be focusing. And I have a simpler, or I should say relatively simpler model that I'm proposing as part of my thesis. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening, and do any of you have any questions?
I have one question for you.
Okay.
How is it that you think the parent-child relationship is different than the supervisor-subordinate relationship?
As I said in my slide, at a minimum, there are at least 2 ways that this relationship is different. A parent-child usually is a familial relationship, right? The parent is either the mother or the father or stepmother. There is some kind of blood relationship going on between a parent and child, but that's not true for, or usually not true for, a leader and an employee. Similarly, the parent-child relationship is going to last a lifetime. At least, the child is going to outlive, in most cases, the parent's lifetime. So for the parent, the relationship is going to last for the entire lifetime. But for a leader and a follower, that's not true either. Your relationship starts with you joining the job, and then it usually ends when you leave the company. And because a parent-child is also a familial relationship, parents, especially when children are young, are far more responsible for the child's development and safety and growth. But that's not true for a leader. Usually by the time an individual joins the workforce is an adult, and the leaders are not responsible entirely for the adult's safety or growth. It's a 50-50 relationship. The employee themselves are also equally responsible for their growth and development, which is not true when the child is very young in a parent-child relationship.
That suggests to me that it might be rather difficult to establish a secure base in an organizational setting because the family relationship is so much more intense. Can you comment on that?
That's probably true, but given that there are similarities, I'm hoping that similarities will help me move the research forward. And existing research has also found that the fact that the leader still does help the employee grow and provide support and encouragement does fulfill certain aspects of being a secure base for your employee. So I'm hoping that these similarities is going to help with my research.
I have a comment on this analogy. I think it's a good analogy, or it's good to have an analogy. That's how we make progress. And I like the parenting analogy in particular, because that suggests that leadership may be a function of not just one individual, but a team. In parenting, it's a dyad, right? It's the parents who exert the leadership function, or the parenting function, sorry. Or sometimes might be a village. In organizations, it may be a leadership team or a committee. So I would like to kind of suggest that your definition could be maybe more comprehensive if includes leadership as a property of individuals and or teams rather than just individuals.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. I did read some research when I was doing my lit review that suggested that it need not be contained to just a dyadic relationship. If you can experience safety and support and encouragement consistently from a group or from a community or an organization, then they all, in essence, become secure base for this individual. So you're right. If I can technically expand my definition, I just stuck to leadership since I was focusing on just the dyadic relationship. But yes, all these other components can also serve the same function.
Do we have other questions?
I have one more. How long a period so is there some sort of balancing act before time spent in interactions or intensivity of how intense the interactions are with the leader in order for this to, or is there some amount, does the follower need to be sufficiently needy before this can occur?
So that's a question for which I don't have an answer. I haven't found anything in research that has stated an amount of time. I did find research that spoke about counselors and psychologists in therapy becoming secure base for their clients. And a lot of those counseling sessions were either 6 months or a year. So I'm guessing here that 6 months might help someone experience secure base, but I'm not sure because I haven't found anything else that has done that has said that, hey, 6 months or a year or just 3 or 4 interactions will help. But I'm assuming that if as an individual you have never experienced secure base or you have attachment issues, if you come in contact with somebody who's going to be consistently helping you grow, you are bound to experience secure base to an extent. I just don't know if it's going to be 100%. Does that answer your question, Professor? Okay, thank you.
Feel free to question or have comments on Sean's talk as well.
I have a question for Sean. There's been so much confusion around these terms, and so many of these terms have been used interchangeably. Why do you think that occurred? And why do you think it has occurred for decades now?
Mainly because initially it was conceptualized as the same construct, and then people said it actually wasn't, and it was a different construct. And then from that, we didn't really have any prevailing scales that said this is this. It kind of might be used. For example, you might saw a lot of people in the literature will use role conflict as a role overload measure, or have previously, or for example, quantitative workload as a role overload measure. And a lot of it comes from the fact we don't have a prevailing measure we can use that we say this is what role overload is, like we do with role conflict, where we had Rizzo's at all scale for the longest time, and the same thing with role ambiguity, where we also had Rizzo at all scale for the longest time.
Okay, I have a related question because this is something I've run into with measures of intrinsic motivation and self-efficacy, that sometimes it's difficult to write. Sometimes it's difficult to write a measure that is sensitive enough to capture distinctions between overlapping domains. So do you foresee any difficulties with not being able to disentangle your measure of your construct from other possibly closely related or highly correlated constructs?
We may run into that. We haven't gotten to the construct validation study yet to know exactly if it'll disentangle how we believe it will. But based on like our facets, which are very highly correlated, because it's quantitative rollover data and qualitative rollover data, they disentangle in our preferred factor analysis, and the model fits correctly. So based on that, I would guess that we probably won't have issues, but we will see what happens when we run into that, because that just depends on what we find in our construct validity study.
So let me ask one more in terms of, and I might have missed this, you might have said it, in terms of practice for the manager. If you do find that you can develop a reliable measure in this day and age where we have layoffs, these really lean organizations, and people have complicated lives, then what can managers do to ease role overload? Particularly, maybe they can only ease the perceptual side of it, not the objective side of it.
Yeah, I argue that's the main argument I have against for rollover versus workload, is that perception matters a lot. We've seen that a lot, and I think perception is the main important thing. But it kind of depends on what type of rollover we find in our designs. So as we talked about the previous question, we talked about family rollover. Maybe we give that person flex time so they can take like 30 minutes during the middle of the day to deal with their child for something they have to go do, like take them to a doctor's appointment or whatever. Or we give them daycare services, or we provide them more training so they don't feel as overloaded because they feel like they can deal with the task now that they understand it better, for example. So it really just depends on what our diagnostics scale says the exact role overload is, and that will be determine kind of how the individual will then use that information to improve the situation, because it depends. It varies dramatically.
So I'm not sure if Abe is still on here, but I'm going to channel Abe for a moment, because he would be all over the notion of to what extent could we use automation to reduce role demands and reduce role overload. You mentioned training. Could be other things that could be done in the work environment to reduce the experience?
Again, it also depends. For example, if we look at an example we can talk about as qualitative things. If we have qualitative things, that means the amount of the physical label is too difficult for the person, or they don't have the ability to do that. So we could give them some equipment that allows them to do it, or some brace to help support them in their role to deal with the issues they're running into. So beyond just automaticity, we also have other aspects we can help the person with. And even, for example, with quantitative data, where we say there's just too much work for the person, we can say training to make it more automatic. We could also hire more staff as one of the other options, or reduce the workload, or try to develop a process that makes the workload involve technology more and make it easier on the person. So there's many paths the person can take to actionalize and alleviate role overload. And it just depends on what's best for the organization and the situation they're in.
So I actually had a question. So in general, with the stress literature, it sounds like role overload is a fairly bad thing, but stressors can be both challenging and hindrances. And so is there any aspect where role overload might be more of a challenge stressor rather than a hindrance, as we've been discussing? And if so, how would you capture that?
Yes, so there is the aspect where previously there's some cases where role overload has actually not had like a negative correlation with that, and that's because in some jobs it is a stressor. But I'm arguing, and I believe based on the fact that it's the bad conceptualization of what we have in the measures of current role overload, they don't actually involve the words of how you feel or perceive. They say, does my job have too much work for me in a sense, or have a lot of work for me to deal with. It's not saying, do you feel that your job has too much work? So your job having a lot of work, for example, workload, it's confounding it with workload, which can be a challenge to some people. Whereas I believe that role overload is just a pure hindrance thing if we conceptualization based on a person's perceptions that they just have too much to do. Whereas, go ahead.
So you sound like you're saying it's both objective, but then also a perceived workload.
So there's two separate things. Role overload's all about the perception. So there's measures of quantitative workload out there. For example, Spector et al.'s. I argue that's the reason why we find that role overload historically can occasionally be a challenge stressor is because the items were very similarly worded to what the quantitative workload items were. They read almost identically to it. And we find that a lot when we do content validation is they continuously get confused with workload items. Whereas our new items don't really get confused with the workload items. And they're more about the person's perceptions of the environment instead of them having a challenge because others. So for example, a person who perceives they have too much work isn't probably going to take that as a challenge. They're going to say that's a hindrance. Whereas if this person just says objectively they have a lot of work, that could be a challenge or a hindrance depending on the person.
So the one thing I might suggest you look into. One of the things I do is I interview law officers and law enforcement people, and one of the things that they often bring up is they enjoy all the higher workload, the changing variety of things they have to do, something new each day, and then they always do tack on. There's always something to do. There's more to do. There's objectively a lot of work there, and so I could see the perspective of higher objective workload typically might be seen as a higher role overload, but that could still, to people that reach for those what are they called, those stretch goals, objectively they could have a lot of work, but they could still see that as a challenge.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to disentangle. So role overload's based on the perception. Do they believe they have too much work for themselves to deal with? So they're not treating it as a challenge, whereas they objectively have a lot of work. That can either be a challenge or a hindrance depending on the person's outlook on the situation. So what we're trying to do is look at the person's kind of perception of the situation. So as in your example, they wouldn't perceive as they have too much work because they enjoy it, they want more work, they always want to do something else. Therefore, they wouldn't be role overloaded, but they would be high on a quantitative workload scale still. So am I making the argument kind of clear there? Or?
Yeah, I think I understand. My other question is, because I don't know, is there any research that's supporting that if someone perceives their work as being highly overload or too much that they can't find that as a challenge stressor rather than a hindrance stressor?
So yes, there is some research previously that have looked at trying to disentangle the hindrance versus challenge stressor, but a lot of that comes down to be very contradictory because again, our measures have been, for lack of a better word, insufficient really, psychometrically and conceptually. So maybe we find that in the future that it is still both with the way we conceptualized it, and then we'd have to address it then. But based on how I think and conceptualize it, I don't think it could be a challenge stressor with the way we have kind of shifted it towards our perception thing. But we still may find it in the future, and then we'll have to address it from that.
Right, and I think one way to even with the current research that you're doing to address that would just be look at exponential function rather than just a straight linear correlation. And I think that would potentially solve that issue, or at least clarify for you in your results.
All right, we have time for more questions. And if we don't have more questions or comments, we can stop here. Thank you to the presenters and to the audience. We'll see you next week.